Welcome and thank you everyone who is watching today. I'm excited to have Elaine here. Elaine is an expert on Islam, especially its doctrines, and has just released a new book which she will introduce to us shortly. Hi Elaine, it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Max. And welcome. Thank you to everyone who's watching today. I'm really glad you're here.
Thank you, Elaine. My question is, what happened at the Zoroastrian temple during the brutal Muslim Arab invasion over 1,300 years ago? And I believe the answer lies somewhere in the Elaine's talk today. But before I pass the microphone to Elaine, let me show you what Iran was like before this brutal invasion.
Iran is a cultural heritage with a common spiritual principle and identity. It's a civilization based on the 5,000-year Zoroastrian tradition of what is good and what is bad. But why Islamic ideologies do not fit in Iran? Islam is a pan-Arabism religion that originally aims to unite Arabs in terms of a common language and culture, including all Arabs from the Atlantic to the Arabian Sea along the North African region as a nation. In contrast, Iran has always been a diverse nation in terms of ethnicity, language, religion and culture, which has grown together throughout its 7,000-year rich history. Today, the Arab population in Iran makes up only 2%. Others include Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Lurs, Turkmens, Kaskai, Gilaks, Talishis, Baluchs, Georgians, Armenians and Brahui. And they all are Iranians, not Arabs. Therefore, Islamic ideologies and Sharia law are inadmissible in Iran, even if the mullahs try to enforce them by force. The fact is that Iran is not one race, not one language, not one soil, not one way of life, and not one religion. Iran is a historically diverse society where women and men were equal prior to mullahs' invasion.
Now, looking at today's Iran, we still see Iranians being killed by the leftovers of the Muslim Arabs who regained power in 1979. Since then, they have taken hundreds of thousands of Iranian lives. Here is the latest report by Amnesty International, placing the mullahs at the world's top executors with staggering 74% of all executions.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Max. And just before switching over, you reminded me of Saudi Arabia when you're speaking of the wonderful, rich fabric of Iran. And you look at Saudi Arabia, this is a monoculture. You can only be a citizen if you are a Muslim. This is a monoculture. It's quite different.
Yeah.
So I'll switch over now. And I'll also mention that you remind me that I became interested in this subject because of Iran. I spent Christmas with a refugee from the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And I learned how he and his friends had been tortured and killed simply because they were Baha'i. And I had never heard of anything like that ever in my life. And that began a lifelong interest.
By the way, do you know why they execute Baha'is?
Well, because it's not Islam. They have in Islam, the seal of the prophets has to be Muhammad. And even though the Baha'i accept Muhammad, they accept other prophets as well and later prophets. So yes. For that reason, they were executed. But so I'll just get on with my presentation here. And I'll say that, in the beginning, like most people, I just thought it was government. This was pure politics and Iran had a bad government. But then when you see the same sort of things happening all around the globe and the common denominator is always Islam, then you begin to study the doctrine and think, well, what is the doctrine that all of these people are following that causes them to do this everywhere? And the doctrine is the Koran and the Hadith. Now, This was not readily available to the average person until very recently, but now we have electronic communication, better literacy in the Middle East itself. And so now people are learning, and, there is an attempt to silence people, with calls of, Islamophobia and things like that, which isn't reasonable. We're simply looking at the doctrine here. What does the doctrine say? And it's not in chronological order, which makes it very difficult for people to understand. Now, the Hadith, a lot of people have not heard of. These are the stories and traditions about Muhammad. So anything he said or did is very important. This is part of Sharia. It's recommended or forbidden, depending on what Muhammad said and did. So to put it all in context, you need to know his life. And I do recommend reading this one, although it is very difficult. It's not been Baudelarized, like this is an accurate account. And it's Life of Muhammad by Ibn Ishaq. This goes back to the 8th century, and you can find many details there that you won't find elsewhere. Now, this is Reliance of the Traveler. I have a copy on my shelf. This is a compendium, a manual, a classic manual of Islamic law. But it's important to understand that Islamic law is not found in a book. It is everything that has to do with Islam. Every aspect of life is either obligatory, recommended, permitted, discouraged, or forbidden, depending on what it says in the Koran and what Muhammad did. And in the Koran itself, in Quran 45:18, you can see at the bottom here, it says the word Sharia in this ayah, and that's a verse. It says, "Now we have set you, O Prophet, on the clear way of faith, so follow it, and do not follow the desires of those who do not know the truth." So that's any non-Muslim. So the ordained way of Islam is Sharia. And the order of authority is the Quran and Hadith. This is the highest authority. If it's in there, then it is definitely Islam. But of course, things need to be applied in the present day. And so you will have consensus of the companions, of the scholars, and then the opinions of the companions, because those are sometimes recorded as well. Now, this statistical analysis was done by Dr. Bill Warner. He's done quite a bit. And this is just to show you how much of the Quran is actually about the non-Muslim. And this is why non-Muslims need to know what it says. It's about them. 64% of the Quran is about the non-Muslim, and it's not good news. So 81% of the book I showed you is about the non-Muslim. 37% of the collected stories and traditions of Muhammad in Bukhari's collection, because there are many. And to show you here what happened, first 13 years, there was no jihad and no violence. So Muhammad was strictly a prophet. He was intolerant, and the Meccans had really had enough of it. And finally, he left in 622. And over the next 10 years, the entire Arabian Peninsula was subdued, forced to submit to Islam, and jihad was introduced. He became a politician. So you can see right here, this marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. And anything before that is from what's called the period of Jahiliyyah. And this is the pre-Islamic period of ignorance. In the Quran, the Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad. And they have all of these different names, ISIS, Boko Haram, Hamas, Hezbollah. They're all jihadis. I refer to them all as jihadis because it's really a distraction to put different names on them all. They are all doing jihad. The expansion included Arabia over the next 30 years. It included Iran and Afghanistan, and then it extended all the way out to Spain eventually. And this was done by conquest. And it's still going on. Slavery is still going on. Slavery has gone on from the beginning. They're not supposed to enslave a Muslim, although if it's a different type of Muslim, they may. The Yazidis, for example, a woman was just released, released, found and released. She had been sold 5 times. So this is still happening. And here they are checking the goods to see if they're all right. And to continue with the history here, hearing the West described as colonizers, and crusaders, there are a lot of terms. Well, the Crusades are the black one, but all of this gray, 557, military jihad. And finally, they were called in for help, and those are the Crusades. And it was Islam is all encompassing. It's more like a 7th century system of governments, and it's got a socio-political, economic facets to it that include, for the poor, this is how the money spent, social services, welfare, certainly, and the needy, emergency relief. But it's also the public service, those who are employed to collect the zakat, for bringing hearts together. So for example, somebody goes to a Dawa event and they're given a free Koran, or someone's taken to dinner. This all comes from bringing hearts together towards Islam. This is the Ministry of Public Information and Propaganda. So a section is for freeing slaves or captives. This is military, includes ransom, prisoner exchange. For those in debt, financial services. For the cause of Allah, fi sabilillah. Now that's important. The cause of Allah is the furtherance of Allah by, fair means or foul, by peaceful means or by violent means. And this includes activist groups, all right? This is military. And for the stranded traveler, foreign affairs. So the imams, mullahs, in Iran, the Islamic State and jihadis are really two sides of the same coin, because in both sides, the doctrine is their authority. And in an Islamic State, the imams and mullahs are the ones who enforce, oppress the believers. We hear about these executions, like you showed at the beginning, all the time. And the jihadis assail the unbelievers in the non-Islamic State. So the modes of entry into non-Islamic countries include jihad by the sword, by migration, by money, jihad of the word, and by the pen. And it always begins with a mosque. Now, a mosque, just as Muhammad did, it can be used for storing weapons, for entertaining dignitaries, for planning battles, prayer rooms, religious organizations, finance and law, education, social political organizations, media, and publishing. So these are all the ways that Islam comes into a non-Islamic country. And as an example of the jihad aspect, the zakat funding, this is an authorization from the Canadian Council of Imams, and this is for the National Canadian Council of Muslims, and they are funded under the fi sabilillah category, the cause of Allah. And because it says they are very successful in presenting Muslim viewpoint in media, either by writing to the editor or by paid articles and legal services. So these are the things that they do. It is an activist group. And this shows the growth of the organizations in Germany. And here is the current accounting manual for Islamic finance. And Islamic finance is spreading right around the globe. And with it comes zakat. Any profits, anyway, they have to pay this 2.5% Islamic tax. It's collected by the Sharia board. Islamic finance will always have a Sharia board. The highest halal food expenditure per capita is happening in non-Islamic countries in Europe and North America. And here we have from the classic manual of Islamic law I showed you earlier, the 8 categories. And it must be distributed among all 8. And the 7th is for jihad. Now, here's an example of Islamic finance in Canada. In Canada, they want to be very multicultural and they want to support multiculturalism. And this Islamic finance is billed as being socially responsible and ethical investing, which sounds very wonderful. But at the same time, you see how that money can be spent. The largest halal expo in North America is in Canada, and Canada is only 1/10 the size of the US. So here is how halal works in a non-Islamic country. You begin with migration, creates a demand for halal. Then you have certification. You have a Canadian company that applies thousands of dollars for this certification. Now the unbeliever gets involved. not only in paying for certification, but also in purchasing, contributing to profits and assets. The 2.5% funds jihad, which goes back against the unbeliever. And money is coming from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia. This is in my book. It goes right back to a 1979 fatwa that this tremendous money being coming from wealth coming from the oil would be spent to Islamize the West through schools like this one. Now, this is from the Muslim Association of Canada. They already had 40 schools. Now they've, almost 40. And now they've opened up this college and it says, join us in the transformative journey, which it certainly will be as Canada becomes more and more Islamized. It offers authentically grounded within the Islamic worldview, that the programs are founded on a robust pedagogical framework that is epistemologically based on Islamic primary sources, the Koran and Sunnah. So what's in the Quran and Sunnah? Here's an example from a Saudi textbook. What does it say about heretics? Okay, those who, for example, a Shia, for example, the Yazidis, that those slaves were taken from that I showed you earlier, they are guilty of polytheism, placing them outside the faith. But then so are Christians, because they associate others with Allah, in that Christ is supposed to be the Son of God. So that puts them in that category as well. Apostasy is punishable by death. High school texts endorse this penalty. Shunning, fraternizing only with true Muslims, shunning non-believers and misguided Muslims. This comes straight from the Quran, where they are told to be forceful against the disbelievers and merciful amongst themselves. There are actually 13 verses in the Quran telling Muslims not to befriend non-Muslims. Jihad, several passages in the high school textbooks urge violent jihad against non-believers simply for rejecting Islam, like that Baha'i in Iran. Women, they advocate beating them and if they disobey, stoning them if they have adulterous affairs. Gay men can be stoned to death. And what are our schools teaching? Meanwhile, sponsored by the Prince Alawid bin Talal Center, and they are teaching people to be silent about the doctrine of Islam. Now, this is ridiculous. It's the antithesis of Western values. So to be silent about it, to have our colleges telling us to be silent about it, this is not education. Colleges should be speaking about sharing information, not prohibiting it. Now, how does that affect, day-to-day life? Well, even in the 2019 election in Canada, one of the university professors, published this together with our own government contributed, the university contributed, and to print a Muslim voting guide is illegal. Any child in Canada would tell you that this is attempting to influence an election. And yet she printed this with the help of her students. So this is what she's teaching. Now, this same woman wrote this book here, if you can see it, Canadian Islamic Schools. And in it, she thanks the International Institute of Islamic Thought for their generous support and funding. And they are associated with Muslim Brotherhood, going back to the Holy Land Foundation trial, which I'll get to later. But anyway, it broke the act. It went to court afterwards, but of course that was too late. The damage was done. So in the classic manual of law, it says there's no harm in giving a misleading impression if it is required by an interest countenanced by sacred law, that outright lying is permissible in 3 cases, and that deception is permissible to lie when the goal is permissible. Now, the cause of Allah, the furtherance of Islam, is a goal, if the goal is obligatory. And there are several kinds of deception. Taqiyya is to outright lie. It's preferable, Tariya, to mislead information. There's so many examples of this where information is left out to give a different impression. This happens with quotes from the Koran. And you will hear in the public square something very nice, but it's only half the quote. Kitman is to leave something out completely, and Maruna is to suspend Sharia temporarily as if it has nothing to do, or you have nothing to do with Islam. So more statistics from Dr. Warner here. And he did an analysis of the text. And as you can see, like I said, in Mecca, there was no jihad. In Medina, a quarter of that Quran is specifically about jihad. So now 64% is about the unbeliever, a quarter of it is about jihad. And 98% of the jihad in the Quran itself is violent. In the Sirah, 67% of that is violent. That's the biography of Muhammad I showed at the beginning. The Hadith, this is Bukhari, and 21% of that is about jihad. So I got curious about this jihad because an entire chapter of the Quran is called the spoils of war. And the first verse says, they ask you, O Muhammad, about the spoils of war. Say, the spoils are for Allah and the messenger. The messenger is Muhammad. He got 20%. And if there was no fighting, if they went to a neighboring town and said, you need to submit, and they were scared, and they said, okay, we submit, then he got all of it because he didn't have to share. So from the Quran, booty is referred to 17 times, spoils of war 5. Hadith, booty is referred to 254 times, and this is just Bukhari. Spoils of war 24, Surah 105, spoils of war 20. 425 times and an entire chapter of the Quran are about spoils of war. Now, you know, a lot of people think that Islam is a religion of peace, that Muhammad was just a prophet, but he was a jihadi. The last 9 years of his life, there were 65 battles, according to the Sirah. If you look elsewhere, you'll find 95 recorded. But he personally participated in a battle every 6.5 weeks. Well, an average, okay, 27 battles, and that's all documented. So that's not how you usually think of a prophet. So the first phase of jihad always is to establish the mosque. That's the first thing Muhammad did. That is still to this day the same pattern. So we have dialogue and dawah events. They're sometimes called a common word, and people will gather for lunch or whatever and talk about how much their faith means to them. And you will hear part of verses or from a very early times. For example, this one from the very early days of Islam. To you is your religion, for me is mine, when he's still trying to persuade people. And in fact, when you look into this one more closely, you'll find other information about it. But it's the later verses replace or supersede the earlier verses. They're stronger, they are considered better. The other thing I should mention is that Islam is dualistic. So you'll find it said this way one day and that way another day. So later, influential people are given a message of peace. So that's, you know, reaching out to, you know, politicians, teachers, and others. Because Muhammad said he understood the importance of influencers. He said, if only 10 Jews among their chiefs believed me, all Jews would have believed me. So this is what it looks like when it first arrives. This looks very peaceful. This is lovely. This is Vienna. And this imam or mullah is saying, as our faith commands, we preach tolerance and love, and we measure our behavior against the exemplary life of our prophet. Now, I've already showed you what happened with the life of the prophet. He adopted jihad. That's when the success came. But most people will smile, nod their heads, and think, isn't this lovely? And they will not understand that this is actually doublespeak, preaching one thing, doing something else. Phase 2 is when the demands begin, and we're at this point or beyond it in many places on the globe already. And this is from Canada, and there was a summit, and this report was actually paid for by the government. And then there at the summit, all these decisions were made by government representatives to enact many of the demands that were made by this community. And they have a special Islamophobia representative to government. They have a liberal Muslim caucus, which is illegal. There shouldn't be such a thing. The 2019 Muslim voting guide was illegal. The universities. And the demands aren't just in the government sphere, they're also in the public sphere. So this is just in a public street. These girls in Berlin walking down the street, this man chasing him, saying in the name of God, they need to cover themselves. I want to go back to that
Find
one.
a good husband. You walk porn on the street. You seek our generation.
Can you leave this,
Yes,
please?
I can talk. I free speech, not of us. Fuck off. I talk in the name of God. Okay. Yes, I'm sure. I love woman. I love
Name of God.
Because this comes from the Koran. So this is a question of national security. So people are coming from countries where women have to be covered. If they are not covered, they are considered loose, even sluts. They're just loose women and they can be attacked. That is what the Quran says. It says, Prophet, tell your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers to draw their cloaks all over their bodies, screen themselves, that they will be better, that they should be known as free, respectable women, so as not to be, so they will be identified as Muslim, so as not to be, depending on the translation, annoyed, from the Arabic, abused, harassed, hurt, given trouble, annoyed, molested, affronted, assaulted, depending on the translation you use. All of these different things can be done to women who are not veiled. And this is a problem. This is a former MP in Vienna, and he's saying, I myself know fathers who, when their daughters come home in the evening from the problem area, they give them headscarves so they will not be recognized as Austrian. So here we have the mosque, and what happens in the mosque, as I was saying earlier, it can be used to store weapons. There have been weapons found in a mosque just recently. It can be used to plan jihad. This again is from Vienna. And I was mentioning the Muslim Brotherhood earlier. Now, this came out in the 80s, actually. It found its way into a courtroom in early 2000s. And it's an explanatory memorandum from the Muslim Brotherhood. And what it says, and this is what's being carried out, the process of settlement, meaning in North America, is a civilization jihadist process with all the word means. The Ikhwan, that's the Brotherhood, must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers, so that it is eliminated and God's religion, Islam, is made victorious over all other religions. And what does that look like? This is called fitna, all right? And this is chaos. There can be sexual fitna. And this is why women in Afghanistan are not allowed to go out in the street and speak. It's said that will cause sexual fitna. But this is fitna, chaos, to upset a society. Now, here's an example of fitna. Now, this woman here, Harsha Walia, she was born in Bahrain. She came to Canada and became the executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association. And you may have heard of these churches being killed, well over 100 churches over allegations that have never been substantiated. And she is shouting, burn it all down here on Twitter, praising Hamas for its recent attack on Israel. She said, how beautiful is the spirit to get free that Palestinians literally learned how to fly on hang gliders. Then she described this country that she has come to that has been good to her. She says, we are gathered here on land stolen by the Canadian colonialist terror state. Canada and Israel are settler colonial projects. She's making with the native people, want the land back from Turtle Island, which is what the native people call North America, to Palestine. She is not a native person. This is fitna. So when Islam has the upper hand, now we get to the stronger later verses. Fight them, Allah will punish them at your hands, disgrace them, help you to victory over them. So be not weak and ask for peace when you have the upper hand. The first verse of chapter 9 of the Quran says that there is no obligation to any treaty made with an unbeliever. There is no migration after the conquest of Mecca. This is what Muhammad said. There's no migration after the conquest of Mecca, but jihad and good intention for Islam remain. So if you are called by the Muslim ruler for fighting, go forth immediately. And this is one of his followers, Ali, one of his companions, and he was supposed to go fight. And he didn't know why. He turned and he said to Muhammad, what issue do I fight with the people? And Muhammad said, fight them until they bear testimony there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. So resistance to Islam justifies what is then called defensive jihad. And this is what it looks like today. Thousands of Nigerians deliberately targeted, over 50,000 in the last 14 years, shouting, Allahu Akbar, we will destroy all Christians. A man said, if I saw a man with my wife, I would strike him with the blade of my sword. And the news reached Muhammad, who said, people are amazed at the gira, self-respect of Sayyid. By Allah, I have more gira than he, and Allah has more pride, gira, than I. Now, the changing demographics mean that Western laws are inadequate to address this kind of thing. It is the very values we cherish that make us so vulnerable. So this is the crux of it, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the United Nations is supposed to uphold. In that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that they have freedom of religion, and that no one shall be held in slavery. Now, in 1948, when this was introduced, the Islamic countries refused to sign it. They came up with their own. In the Cairo Declaration, it says they have the right to enjoy the freedoms and rights without prejudice to the principles of Islam, Sharia. Sharia rules in Islamic countries, and this is what they follow. This is the problem with the UN, is it has two conflicting universal declarations of human rights, and yet the people who belong here, the largest voting bloc at the UN, vote on all the resolutions. And that's pretty much it. And this is my website. Now, all of the foundational doctrine, along with the tutorial on how to search it, is on the homepage. And there are resources for non-Muslims here, or Muslims, about, history, law, Sharia, women, everything. It is really, if I may say so myself, a wonderful resources website. And this is my book. And this book, it begins with the ABCs of Islam. It's written in a very simple way to introduce it, and then a series of essays that show how Islam is affecting society today in various ways, little examples. And when you get to the end, there's a brief about women, the Muslim Brotherhood, a synopsis of Sharia, and recommendations to prevent Islamization of our countries.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
You can
Elaine.
search my name, by the way, on YouTube as well to find videos about more doctrine.
Thank you so much, Elaine. And I believe one of history's most brutal jihads targeted the highly civilized Zoroastrian nation of Iran in the 7th century. You can discover the immense devastation it caused and its lasting impact on civilizations in my book, Zarathustra Beyond Time. With that, we close it for today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elaine, and have a nice day.